"Mom, the blue light was so beautiful. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have pressed that button." These words came from the mouth of 5-year-old Dmitri Volkov on a rainy afternoon in Manchester, England. In 2019, his mother, Emma, heard her son screaming from the living room while she was making tea. Her son was curled up on the floor in front of the window. Tears were streaming down his face. He was touching his tongue with his small hands. "It tastes like metal," he cried. "When it rains, I taste metal." Emma knelt down beside her son in shock. Her son had never been a dramatic child. He was quiet, thoughtful, a child who would build towers with blocks for hours and ask how birds knew which way to fly. But now, his eyes held a horror unbecoming of a child. "Which button are you talking about, son?" she asked gently. Dmitri looked at her as if she should already know. "I pressed the -5 button. I killed them all." Emma was stunned. Her son was born in England. He had never left the country. He had never been to a nuclear facility. He had never even seen a documentary about radiation or disasters. Yet here he was, talking about buttons, blue light, and a metallic taste that came with the rain. He said it was a taste that survivors of Chernobyl described in the days after the 26th of April, 1986. You are about to witness a case that will force scientists, historians, and skeptics to confront the impossible. The Volkov family led an ordinary middle-class life. Emma worked as a primary school teacher in South Manchester. Her husband Robert was a software engineer. They lived on the third floor of a renovated Victorian building. Their life was predictable, comfortable, and secure. Dmitri was born in 2014. As a baby, he rarely cried. Emma and Robert had no connection to Russia or Ukraine. Emma's family was from Cornwall. Robert's family had emigrated from Poland in the 1960s. There was no Soviet history in their lineage. Chernobyl stories were not told at family dinners. Dmitri had never been exposed to anything related to nuclear disasters. They didn't have a television at home. Dmitri's teachers described him as exceptionally intelligent for his age, but unusually serious. The first incident occurred 3 months after Dmitri's third birthday in September 2018. The family was walking in Heaton Park when it started to rain. Dmitri stopped in the middle of the path. He started vomiting. Emma thought her son had swallowed a bug. But when she asked him what was wrong, the child looked at her with teary eyes. "There is a really bad taste in the air. It tastes like coins," he said. Emma laughed. "Kids say strange things." But a week later, the same thing happened again. Dmitri said something that stunned her. "I can taste this because of ionization. Radiation gives a metallic taste." Emma looked at her 3-year-old son. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. He was talking about ionization and radiation. These weren't words a child would say. That evening, she told Robert about it. Robert thought it was something Dmitri had heard at daycare. He ignored it, but the incidents continued. Every time it rained, Dmitri tasted metal. Each time, he gave more detailed explanations. In December 2018, he told his mother, "The rods are stuck because their ends are made of graphite." In March 2019, he described the blue glow of Cherenkov radiation. He said it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. Emma began writing down everything her son said in a journal. She didn't know why. Perhaps she thought a doctor might need this information. Or maybe she was looking for someone to explain this madness. She reviewed her notes. She realized Dmitri wasn't speaking like a child. He was speaking like someone confessing a crime. The breaking point came on a rainy November afternoon. Emma was in the kitchen when she heard Dmitri's screams. She found him in the living room. His small body was trembling. "I shouldn't have done it," he was crying. "I should have listened to Leonid. I should have stopped the test." Emma took him in her arms. "Who is Leonid?" she asked. Her voice trembled. Dmitri looked at her. At that moment, Emma didn't recognize her son. His eyes were empty, filled with a sorrow that did not belong to a 4-year-old child. Leonid Toptunov. He was the senior reactor control engineer on the night shift. He told me the reactor was unstable. He said the test should be canceled. But Dyatlov yelled at us. He called us cowards. He said we'd lose our jobs if we didn't finish the test. Emma's hands went numb. She recognized these names. Years ago, in college, while writing a paper on the psychological effects of industrial disasters, she had read articles about Chernobyl. Leonid Toptunov was a real name. Anatoly Dyatlov was real. On the 26th of April, 1986, they were working in the control room of Reactor 4, and now her 4-year-old son was reciting their names as if they were standing right beside him. "What test?" Emma whispered. Dmitri closed his eyes. "We were conducting an emergency core cooling system test. We needed to simulate a power outage, but the reactor was already poisoned with xenon. The power was too low. When I pressed -5 for emergency shutdown, the control rods went in, but the graphite tips caused a power surge instead." He opened his eyes and looked at his mother with extreme clarity. "I didn't shut down the reactor, I blew it up." Emma couldn't believe what her son was saying. He had described the exact technical process that caused the Chernobyl explosion. Xenon poisoning. Graphite-tipped control rods, positive void coefficient. These were details not even found in most documentaries. They were details buried in Soviet reports and engineering analyses. When Robert came home that evening, Emma showed him the diary. She played him the audio recording of Dmitri explaining the control panel layout. Robert, who prided himself on logic and reason, sat silently for 20 minutes. Finally, he looked at his wife. He said the words neither of them wanted to hear. "We need to find out who he is." But that was only the beginning. Dr. Helena Petrov had spent 30 years studying cases of people claiming past life memories. Petrov, a psychology professor at University College London, had researched hundreds of children who spoke of past lives. She had found a rational explanation for every case: childhood fantasies, television programs watched and re-watched, conscious or unconscious suggestions from parents. When Emma contacted her in December 2019, Dr. Petrov graciously agreed to meet with the family. He never expected this case to be different from the others. He certainly did not expect a 4-year-old child from Manchester to turn his entire worldview upside down. The first meeting took place one January morning in Dr. Petrov's office. Dmitri sat in a chair that was much too big for him. His feet dangled. His parents waited in the hallway. Dr. Petrov began with simple questions designed to reveal inconsistencies. He showed Dmitri photographs of various industrial facilities not located in Chernobyl. He asked if he recognized any of them. Dmitri shook his head, no to each one. Then he showed him a photograph of Chernobyl's fourth reactor taken from an angle that very few people would recognize. In the photo, the control room door was visible with Cyrillic writing on it. Dmitri's face paled. "I worked there," he said quietly. Dr. Petrov took note. Perhaps he knew because he was lucky. He showed him another photo. This time it was a photo of 3 men in Soviet-era uniforms. "Do you recognize any of these people?" he asked. Dmitri immediately pointed to the man on the left. "That is Leonid. He tried to save us." The man was indeed Leonid Toptunov. However, the photo had never been published in any English-language media. Dr. Petrov had obtained this photo from the Ukrainian archives to conduct this test. He decided to push further. He asked Dmitri to describe the control panel in the fourth reactor's control room. Most people, even those who had studied Chernobyl extensively, could not describe it in detail. The boy closed his eyes. He continued his description. The panel was arranged in a U-shape. The reactor control rods were on the left, operated by a wheel mechanism. The -5 button, the emergency shutdown button, was red. The center console was slightly elevated to prevent accidental pressing. Sear, the senior reactor control engineer, sat at the station on the right. I was sitting behind them at the shift supervisor's desk. Dr. Petrov felt a shiver down his spine. He had spent the previous week studying Soviet plans. The secrecy of the control room lifted. Every detail Dmitri had just described was correct. He tried a different approach. He asked him tricky questions. He deliberately gave him false information. Would he notice? "So the reactor used uranium control rods?" he asked. The rods were made of boron carbide, but their tips were made of graphite. That was the problem. When we inserted the rods during the emergency shutdown, the graphite tips displaced the cooling water. It caused a sudden increase in reactivity. Dr. Petrov's pen stopped writing in his notebook. He was surprised by what he had heard. This information had emerged years after the disaster in technical reports that very few people outside the nuclear engineering community had read. The interview lasted 3 hours. At the end of the interview, Dr. Petrov sat silently. He looked at his notes, trying to find a contradiction in the child's story. But there wasn't one. Either this child had somehow accessed highly technical and largely classified information about the Chernobyl disaster, or he was remembering something impossible to remember. When Emma and Robert returned to the office, Dr. Petrov looked at them with an expression that was impossible to read. "I must be honest with you," he said. "In my 30 years of research, I've never encountered a case like this. Your son's knowledge isn't the kind he could have learned from television or books. Some of what he told me today isn't even available in public sources." He paused for a moment. He chose his words carefully. "If you want answers, there is only one place you can find them. You must take him to Chernobyl." The trip was set for March 2020, just before the world went into lockdown. Emma, Robert, Dmitri, and Dr. Petrov boarded a plane to Kiev. Then they drove from the Ukrainian countryside towards the exclusion zone. Dmitri was quiet during the trip. He stared out the window at the flat, endless landscape. But as they approached the checkpoint at the edge of the zone, something changed. The boy sat up straighter. His breathing quickened. "It smells very different here," he whispered. "The air seems cleaner than before." Emma made eye contact with Dr. Petrov. How did he know what the air used to smell like? After showing their permits, they passed through the checkpoint. Viktor, a Ukrainian guide who had been working in the zone for 15 years, explained the rules. Stay on the marked paths. Don't touch anything. Pick up nothing. Radiation levels were now low, but this place was still haunted. As they advanced deeper into the zone, they passed abandoned villages and forests, reclaiming the roads. Dmitri began to cry. It wasn't the cry of a frightened child. It was the quiet, broken cry of someone returning to the scene of a crime. They stopped at a viewing point overlooking the new safe confinement, the massive steel structure now burying the fourth reactor. Viktor began his prepared speech about the disaster. Dmitri interrupted him. "The explosion happened at 1:23 in the morning," the child said. "The first explosion was a steam explosion. The second was a hydrogen explosion. The graphite fire lasted 9 days." Viktor looked at the child. "How do you know the time?" Dmitri turned to look at him. Viktor took an involuntary step back. "Because I looked at the clock when I pressed the button. I wanted to remember the exact moment I destroyed everything." The group stood silently. The wind carried the faint chemical smell of concrete and decay. Dr. Petrov broke the silence. "Dmitri, do you remember your name? What was your name before?" The child slowly shook his head. "Aleksandr Akimov," he said. "I was a shift supervisor. I was 33 years old. I died of acute radiation syndrome on May 11, 1986. It took 15 days. Emma felt her legs weaken. She had researched that name the night before. Aleksandr Akimov was the shift supervisor on duty during the disaster. He had stayed at the plant after the explosion. He had desperately tried to salvage the situation. He had tried to pump water into the reactor by manually opening the valves. He had been exposed to a lethal dose of radiation. According to survivors, he saw himself as the culprit of the disaster until the day he died. Dr. Petrov had arranged something he hadn't told the family. He had used his connections at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. In Kiev, he had obtained access to a restricted archive containing documents related to the Chernobyl disaster that had never been fully digitized or translated. Most importantly, he had obtained permission to view the personal belongings of the power plant workers who had died after the disaster. These items were stored in a climate-controlled facility. They were rarely examined. Among these belongings were those of Aleksandr Akimov. On their second day in Ukraine, Dr. Petrov took the family to the archive, located in a gray concrete building outside Kyiv that looked old, dating back to the Soviet era. An archivist named Olena greeted them at the entrance. Her face wore a carefully neutral expression. She led them through a corridor lined with filing cabinets. She took them to a small examination room with a cardboard box on a metal table. "These are items taken from Akimov's locker at the factory," she explained. She spoke with an accent. "They were sealed in 1986. They have only been opened twice for inventory purposes." Dr. Petrov looked at Dmitri. The boy had been silent on the way to the archive, but now his eyes were fixed on the box with such intensity that it made Emma's stomach clench. Dr. Petrov spoke in a soft tone. "Dmitri, before you open the box, I want you to tell me what is inside." The boy swallowed. "There is a blue-covered notebook. I kept notes during every shift. There is also a photo of my wife Lubov and our son. His name was Andrei. He was 3 years old when I died." Olena raised her eyebrows. She slowly opened the box. She took out the contents, one by one. There was a pair of glasses, a wristwatch stopped at 1:27, and a pack of cigarettes. There was a small photo, its edges yellowed with time, and a blue notebook, its cover faded but still sturdy. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Dr. Petrov reached for the photo. He lifted it. In the photo was a young woman with dark hair, holding a small child in her arms. On the back were two names written in Cyrillic. Alina translated, "Lyubov and Andrei, May 1984. Dmitri began to cry. "I didn't get to say goodbye to them," he whispered. "I told Lubov I'd be home by morning." Dr. Petrov opened the notebook with slightly trembling hands. The pages were filled with technical notes about the reactor's operation, shift schedules, and safety protocols. It was written in neat Cyrillic. Turning the pages, he translated the important sections for the family. The 25th of April, 1986, was the last date entered. Olena leaned forward. She read aloud in English. "Dyatlov insists we complete the test tonight despite the reactor's instability. Toptunov is concerned about xenon poisoning. I am concerned too, but I cannot refuse the assistant chief engineer. We will continue at 1, and I hope this is the right decision." The words were confessional. Dr. Petrov looked at Dmitri. "Is there anything else in your notes? Something private that only Akimov would know?" Dmitri closed his eyes. "Look at the entry dated the 15th of March, he said. "I wrote about a dream I had. I saw the reactor explode and turn the sky blue. I wrote that I tasted metal when I woke up." The room fell silent. Olena quickly flipped through the pages, going backwards. She found the entry. Her face paled. She read aloud, translating from Russian to English. "Last night I had a very strange dream. The reactor exploded in a blue light. When I woke up, I had a metallic taste in my mouth. Lubov says I need to go on vacation. Maybe she is right." Dr. Petrov leaned back in his chair. His professional composure was gone. He had spent 30 years debunking precisely these kinds of claims. Memory was infallible. He had written articles about the power of suggestion, about the human need to believe in life after death. But here, in this cold archive room, he held evidence that undermined all the rational explanations he had constructed so far. A 4-year-old child from Manchester had described the contents of a notebook that had been sealed for 34 years. He had named a man's wife and child. He had recounted a dream documented in a diary written 6 weeks before the disaster. There was no way he could have known these things. No documentary had covered them. No book had published them. These were the private thoughts of a dead man, locked away in a box the world had forgotten. "How is this possible?" Emma whispered. Dr. Petrov shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "According to all the scientific principles I've learned so far, such a thing is impossible. But the evidence is there. Your son knows things that only Aleksandr Akimov could know." Dmitri reached for the notebook, but he didn't touch it. "I have to tell you something else," he said. His voice was barely audible. "After the explosion, Leonid and I entered the reactor hall. We tried to manually lower the control rods. We opened the valves to pump water into the core. We still thought we could fix it. We stayed there for hours." He looked at Dr. Petrov. "We knew we were going to die. The dosimeters had reached maximum levels, but we couldn't leave. We had to try." These details matched the historical records exactly. Akimov and Toptunov had stayed at the plant for hours after the explosion. They had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation while attempting the impossible. They were heroes. But their heroism had come too late. Olena quietly said something to Dr. Petrov in Ukrainian, and Dr. Petrov nodded. "There is one more thing," he translated. "He is talking about a letter." Akimov tried to write a letter to his wife from the hospital, but he didn't finish writing it. His hands were badly damaged by the radiation. Olena carefully pulled a single sheet of paper from the bottom of the box. The handwriting was shaky. It was almost illegible. It was left unfinished in the middle of the page. She read the letter aloud. "Dear Lyubov, I am so sorry. I pressed the button. I thought I was saving them. Tell Andrei that his father loved him more than anything. Tell him the blue light was very beautiful. Tell him." The letter ended there. Dmitri looked at his mother. Emma saw in her son's eyes a pain no child should ever have to bear. "That is why I had to come here," she said. "I had to finish the letter. I needed to tell them I was sorry." Dr. Petrov wiped his eyes. He had built a career on skepticism. He had turned away countless grieving parents and their extraordinary children. But now he was crying over a scientifically implausible case in an archive in Ukraine. He looked at Dmitri. He wasn't just a 4-year-old child. He saw the ghost of a man who had carried guilt for 33 years, waiting for a chance to speak. Dr. Petrov said, "Aleksandr Akimov was not responsible for Chernobyl. The reactor design was flawed. The safety culture had broken down. You were following orders in an impossible situation. The guilt you carry belongs not to you, but to the system." For the first time since arriving in Ukraine, Dmitri smiled. It was a small smile. "Thank you," he whispered. And at that moment, everyone in the room felt the presence of something they couldn't name. Something they had waited decades to hear. The family returned to Manchester in late March 2020, just as the world was beginning to shut down due to the pandemic. In the months that followed, the pandemic forced everyone to stay home. Dmitri changed. The nightmares that had troubled him since he was 3 years old slowly began to fade. The metallic taste that came with the rain didn't completely disappear. But he no longer had panic attacks. Emma noticed her son smiling more often. He played more freely. He talked less about control rooms, radiation, and guilt. It was as if the trip to Chernobyl had released something that had been trapped inside him for 33 years. Dr. Petrov stayed in touch with the family, documenting Dmitri's process. He wrote an article that would become one of the most controversial in the field of reincarnation studies. He titled it, "The Akimov Case: Past Life Memories Verified by Archives." When he presented his findings at a conference in 2021, half the audience walked out. The other half gave him a standing ovation. By the time Dmitri turned 6 in 2021, his memories had begun to fade like old photographs exposed to sunlight. He still remembered some things. He remembered fragments of another life that occasionally surfaced in his dreams or were triggered by certain smells. But the overwhelming sense of guilt that had defined his early childhood was gone. Emma once asked him if he still thought about Aleksandr Akimov. Dmitri, with his never-growing-up seriousness, thought carefully about the question. "Sometimes I do," he said. "But it seems very distant now, like a movie I saw a long time ago." Emma asked if it had always been like that. She wondered if children like Dmitri only carried these memories for a short time, just long enough to convey the message the dead wanted to send. Long enough for a soul that had wandered for decades with guilt to find peace. Dr. Petrov visited them one last time in the summer of 2022. He brought a gift he had obtained after careful negotiations with Ukrainian authorities. It was a copy of the photograph in Akimov's closet showing Lyubov and Andrei. Dr. Petrov had written, "We forgive you" in English on the back of the photograph. He gave the photo to Dmitri. The child held it in his hands for a long time. Then he carefully placed it in the drawer next to his bed. What happened to Dmitri Volkov proved something that science has struggled to accept for centuries. Memory is not limited to a single lifetime. Trauma can reverberate for decades. And sometimes, circumstances come together in ways we don't yet understand. A soul gets a second chance to finish unfinished business. The child who tasted metal in the rain, who spoke of blue lights and emergency buttons, carried the final confession of a man who held himself responsible for the world's worst nuclear disaster. He came across countries, languages, and decades to deliver a message Aleksandr Akimov couldn't complete. And in doing so, he proved that some truths are too powerful to remain buried even in the radioactive wreckage of Reactor 4. The case remains open. Dr. Petrov continues to search for other children carrying impossible memories. Emma and Robert have become advocates for families with similar experiences. They established a support group for parents whose children recount their past lives with unsettling accuracy. And Dmitri, he is now 9 years old. He wants to be an engineer when he grows up. Not a nuclear engineer, maybe an aeronautical engineer. He wants to work in a job that builds rather than destroys. On rainy days, he sometimes stands by the window and watches the rainfall. Emma wonders if he still tastes metal. She doesn't ask him questions anymore. Do you believe Dmitri really carries the memories of Aleksandr Akimov? Do you believe that a 4-year-old child somehow accessed the final thoughts of a man who died 33 years before he was born? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this is a coincidence that a child in Manchester somehow learned secret information about the Soviet nuclear disaster through an undiscovered method? But before you decide, remember this: the notebook was sealed and stored for 34 years. The dream about the blue light and metallic taste was written 6 weeks before the reactor exploded, and a 4-year-old child described both with perfect accuracy. Some mysteries require us to expand what we believe is possible. Some cases provide evidence that death may not be the end of consciousness, that memory can persist after the body's demise. It forces us to confront the reality that the universe holds records we are only beginning to understand. This is the story of the child who remembered Chernobyl. This is the story of guilt that travels through lifetimes seeking forgiveness. This is a story that science cannot explain but cannot deny. Subscribe to join us as we uncover the next mystery, the next impossible truth, the next case that will challenge everything you thought you knew about life, death, and memories that refuse to die.